Laugh.
Y'all, what is up? It is me, Dr. CBS. Welcome to the Talk Black segment on this Good Tuesday. I'm here with my girl, Dr. Layla Brown, where we talk back about all things Black.
All right, y'all. So today we have the illustrious, the indescribable Dr. Gerald Horne in the building, and who really needs no introduction, but we will give a little bit of one. But before we get to that, it's time for this week's plant of the day. So some of you all may know, obviously, I'm not home. CBS is not home. But we're in this lovely Airbnb that happens to have this corn plant behind me. So the official name is a Dracaena fragrans, often known as the corn plant. One of the things that I wanted to say about this particular plant is that this is a slightly more mature plant. I have a smaller one. You can't really see this one, but I have a smaller and a medium-sized one. This particular plant can grow up to about 6 feet in the house. It can also flower, but they typically don't flower indoors. It's native to the tropical regions of Africa, actually from east to west. So from the Ivory Coast all the way to the Sudan. But another important thing about this plant is that if you have pets at home, it is toxic. So this is one of those ones that you need to keep away from your plants. From your pets. But this week's, again, plant is the corn plant or the Dracaena fragrans. And the other thing I want to say about this is that it's a kind of slow growing plant.
It browns too.
It browns. It can struggle, but if you have a regular watering schedule, you can usually get around it, and you can usually cut those pieces off, and it'll do well. So we kick it back to Dr. CBS.
All right, y'all. So as Layla said, Dr. Horne is probably the only academic on earth who needs no introduction. But in case you have been sleeping under a rock, he is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston and the author of over 45 books. Now, the website says 30. That's late. It's 45, right? 45 books, including White Supremacy Confronted, US Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa from Rhodes to Mandela, and The Bittersweet Science, Racism, Racketeering, and the Political Economy of Boxing. So welcome, Dr. Gerald Horne.
Thank you for inviting me.
Of course.
Thanks for coming.
Yes, good morning. All right, so let's jump right into it because we have a lot of ground to cover. So to start, can you speak about the deteriorating situation of U.S. imperialism, especially as it relates to China and the European Union?
Well, as we speak, the United States faces two stiff challenges. One is obvious. It's clear that Mr. Biden, following on Mr. Trump and Mr. Obama, wants to pivot hard towards the People's Republic of China. But what's interesting is, how did China get into the passing lane in the first instance? And in order to understand that, you have to understand the fact that in the early 1970s, US imperialism was facing a very stiff challenge, not only from the socialist camp, but from national liberation movements in Grenada, Nicaragua. United States imperialism had been evicted from Vietnam and Indochina in 1975. And in that context, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon negotiate this entente with China. That is to say that China signs on the dotted line, on the anti-Soviet dotted line, and in return receives massive concessions in the form of foreign direct investment. You can visualize, as I speak, jobs floating across the Pacific from the United States into China. And that, in my estimation, might well turn out to be the most disastrous geostrategic miscalculation in the history of the world, because it's basically put China in the passing lane, not only jeopardizing capitalism. Of course, we can have a separate discussion about China's entree into capitalism, but also jeopardizing white supremacy itself, which has been the calling card of the North Atlantic countries for centuries now. But as if that were not enough, US imperialism also faces a lesser challenge from the European Union. On the Atlantic side of the equation, That is to say that I would recommend in this context the book by Columbia University law professor Anu Bradford, A-N-U Bradford, called The Brussels Effect, How the EU Rules the World. Now, that title might sound provocative, but when you consider that even after Brexit, the European Union has a larger population than the United States of America, therefore a larger market. And what happens is that the EU is a regulatory superpower, so to speak. Just like in the United States, there's a California effect. When California decides that auto emissions should be at a certain level, that forces car manufacturers, rather than make one car for the California market and another car for 49 other markets, they just adhere to the California regulations. And therefore, there's a California effect. And so likewise, you see Brussels establishing the rules of the road for the entire capitalist world to a certain extent, which makes even more curious Mr. Biden's nostrum that in the 21st century, it should be Washington, not China, making the rules of the road. And Brussels is raising his hand and says, hello, don't forget about us. And so you see this conflict between the EU and the United States with regard to Airbus now driving Boeing into the dust. You see it with regard to the latest climate plan from the European Union, where they're going to basically phase out the internal combustion engine in their market, which means that General Motors and Ford have to act similarly, which means that as you two young women reach middle age, most likely you will not be driving an internal combustion car. You'll be driving an electric car. And so those are the stiffer challenges that the US imperialism faces, which makes all the more poignant the fact that it's now being evicted from Afghanistan. Although what the corporate media has not told you is that despite all of the talk about misogyny resurfacing in Kabul after the Taliban comes to power, which will probably take place sooner rather than later, and I will not dispute that assertion, expect Washington to collaborate with the Taliban because Afghanistan has a border with Iran, which is now in the crosshairs, despite Biden rhetoric to the contrary. And it's also not far distant from China and Russia. That's too delicious a proposition to ignore. Speaking of Russia, we expected Mr. Biden to try to work out some sort of reverse Kissinger maneuver with Russia in his meeting with Mr. Putin in the last few weeks. That is to say, to woo Russia, but there's so much anti-Soviet and anti-Russian sentiment in the United States right now that it's going to be difficult for the United States to work out any sort of entente with Russia against China, even though we keep being told that China is the ball game. And that, of course, brings us to the so-called US backyard. I'm speaking of the recent events in Cuba, where Mr. Biden is tugging hard and moving directly towards embracing Trump foreign policy with regard to the island and rejecting the foreign policy of the Obama-Biden administration. That's up to and including what I call balloonatics politics. You may recall that during the Cold War, the United States was trying to use balloons to float over Eastern Europe, to drop propaganda and have radio signals and all the rest. Now they're talking about using balloons to have US-dominated internet in Cuba from these balloons overhead. Now, of course, Cuba has pilots. They may want to shoot down those balloons. That's why I call it balloonatics policy. And of course, that also ties into policy towards Haiti, because historically, one of the reasons that US imperialism has either supported dictators in Haiti or looked the other way is because of its proximity to Cuba post 1959 after the revolution. That's why it supported the Duvaliers, father and son, from the 50s up through the mid 1980s. And that's why it's going to be very difficult for US imperialism as allies in Ottawa and Brussels and Paris to move away from that harebrained policy. So I'll stop there in case there are any comments.
Well, you've already taken it to the U.S. backyard, but one of the things that I wanted you to maybe speak a little bit more about, so as we've been talking a lot about Cuba, excuse me, Cuba in particular, but also Haiti. One of the things that's come up in the last few weeks in sort of public discourse is the way the left in the US seems to overly sympathize with the state as a regime and is somewhat, I don't know, ignoring or not conscientious about the continued disputable state of Afro-Cubans on the island. And so I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit for our audience about what it means to think about the Cuban government on the left as a regime and the sort of ongoing racial politics on the island.
With regard to that issue. For example, with the Obama policy allowing more remittances, that is to say money flowing from the United States into Cuba, given the fact that white supremacy, surprise, surprise, reigns in Florida, what that meant was that Euro-Cubans could send more money to their relatives in Cuba, more so than Afro-Cubans, which exacerbates the racial divide. Likewise, with regard to the Airbnb, for example, where people can rent out rooms, because of the historic legacy of white supremacy on the island, that meant that Euro-Cubans could gain an advantage there. And then, of course, there's the suffocating blockade. That is to say, President Lopez Obrador of Mexico, in light of the recent protests in Cuba, suggested that in order to alleviate the misery that so many endure on the island, that the first step should be lifting the blockade, which was tightened by Mr. Trump, imposing 243 more sanctions. But I think that with people in the United States, when they begin to analyze Cuba, they should keep a number of factors in mind. Number one, if this current regime is overthrown or even weakened, do not expect Black people in Cuba to engage and have some sort of renaissance. If anything, they'll be thrown further back, perhaps even to the level of Black people in the United States, believe it or not. And secondly, I think that the people in the United States should be keen to the international community sentiment. That is to say, the recent United Nations vote on the blockade, there are only two nations that supported the blockade against Cuba. That's the United States and Israel. Almost 200 nations voted against it. And I think one of the reasons is that there is historic memory of the role that Cuban troops played in the liberation of Southern Africa. That is to say, they did the heavy lifting in terms of defeating the apartheid army on the battlefield of Southern Angola and Northern Namibia, leading to the independence of Namibia in 1990, South Africa in 1994, which of course brings us to South Africa because one of the political problems was that the Cubans did the heavy lifting, then they went home. This was taking place in the context of the erosion, if not collapse, of socialism in Eastern Europe, which had been the major ally of liberation forces. And so what that meant, that going into the new dispensation post-1994, the European minorities still have the backing of Washington because Black Americans, despite all their blather, were not able to necessarily shape that particular pillar. And the liberation forces were wounded and weakened. Now, of course, Black Americans didn't realize that because since the Compromise of 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, anti-Jim Crow concessions in favor of throwing the left overboard, there's been hardly a speck of internationalism in the Black community on a consistent basis. It's been episodic. And so whenever you hear any Black Americans talk about China, for example, which is one of the most staggering and stunning developments of this century or any century, they only echo the State Department line. China is the new colonialist in Africa, which Anthony Blinken would heartily endorse, but which makes us look suspect in the international community, and then compromises our ability to get international support, just manifested, for example, at the United Nations Human Rights Council, where former president of Chile, Michelle Bachelet, issues this report, not only calling for reparations to Black Americans, but launching an investigation of police terror against Black Americans, one of the most significant developments in recent history. But as I'm sure Professor CBS would tell you, and she always wants me to talk in this vein, that many of our intellectuals and organizations, they don't have a clue when it comes to any sort of global analysis, which means that they're at best mild tacticians because you can't have a strategy unless you have a global analysis. And most of them don't have any sort of global analysis, which means they don't have any strategy to lift us up. So to come back to your point, I think that those who are sincerely concerned about the fate and plight of Afro-Cubans should in the first instance be concerned about lifting the blockade. Now, I could go into a whole exposition of how the situation of Black Cubans differs from those on the mainland. As I say in my 16th century book, there was a critical distinction between Spanish colonialism and the English colonialism, which we've been subjected to. There were African conquistadors from the inception of the early 1500s on the island. And of course, a strategic ambition of the settlers in the United States has been to keep guns out of the hands of the Black population, even if it might jeopardize national security, for example. So as a result, you had a larger free Black population on the island during the era of slavery. You had more, as I point out in my book on Cuba, one of the reasons why the July 26 movement of the Castro brothers was able to surge to power in 1959 was that in the pre-1959 dispensation, the Africans were leading the Communist Party of Cuba, and the United States was so fixated, needless to say, on that factor that they slept on the July 26 movement. And then the July 26 movement surged to power, and there was a merger between the July 26 movement and the Communist Party of Cuba. Now, you know, many of these people in the United States, these intellectuals who Professor CBS likes to chide and critique, have no knowledge of this kind of history, which helps to justify her chiding and critiquing.
Thank you. Thank you for noting that I am justified in my chiding and critiquing. But just to pivot just a little bit to the African continent. So France recently pulled troops out of Mali, Chad, and Burkina Faso, effectively perhaps ending one phase of the war on terror on the African continent. So I was just wondering, what does this actually mean for perhaps AFRICOM, for the continued shifting of the war on terror to the African continent? But also, does this represent yet another failure or decline in Western imperialism?
To a degree, it does. But there are a couple factors I'd like to bring into play. One with regard to AFRICOM. Although the US press did not cover it, in the last few weeks, some of the most significant military exercises in the history of the African continent were held in Northern and Western Africa, with AFRICOM in the forefront, and of course the Moroccans playing a key role. I say, of course, the Moroccans because one of the many reasons why many of us are now sitting in North America is because in 1591, the Moroccans collaborated with London in terms of subduing the Songhai Empire, which was a major political force on the African continent. And with the subduing of the Songhai Empire, you saw the softening up of Africa for the onrushing African slave trade, because that episode ricochets westward to what is now Senegal, to Ghana, et cetera, and to northern Nigeria. So Morocco is playing its historic role. But the second factor I would mention is the role of Turkey. That is to say that Turkey, you may know, from the 1500s up until the end of World War I, circa 1918, 1919, that is to say 400 years, was the so-called caliphate. It was the big dog in terms of the Muslim powers. And what happened, of course, is that it was defeated because it sided with Germany during World War I. But now Turkey is having a resurgence. So if you look at Somalia, for example, and if you look at most of the African countries with sizable Muslim populations, Turkey is playing a major role. And Turkey is increasingly coming into conflict with France. As a matter of fact, the rhetoric between the two has been sharpening and escalating in recent months. Now, of course, expect US imperialism to try to play on those contradictions to its benefit, but it would behoove the intellectuals and organizations in our community, such as they are, to pay attention to these kinds of conflicts and contradictions, because I dare say what happens in Africa eventually will resonate and redound either positively or negatively in Black America.
Absolutely. Well, you've already evoked South Africa to a degree, but in continuing this conversation about the current state of U.S. and perhaps more broadly Western imperialism, can you speak a little bit about the ongoing situation with Zuma in South Africa and even what's happening in Eswatini as well?
Yeah, it's a chronicle of a tragedy foretold in South Africa. What I mean is, it was almost inevitable that post 1994, with the major allies of the liberation forces weakened, not only the socialist camp collapsing, but then Cuba goes through the special period post 1989, post 1991, et cetera. Whereas the ally of the European minority is strengthened by that very same factor. And then, of course, you have the fact that post 1994, you see the neighbor in Zimbabwe try to engage in land reform to redistribute the wealth, but there is a hysterical reaction in Washington, in London, and Canberra, Australia. And once again, many of our friends and comrades in Black America do not bathe themselves in glory in the aftermath of the Zimbabwean attempt at land reform. Some of the sternest critics of land reform in Zimbabwe happen to be those who in Black America pose as the most left-wing forces. However, that sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe was a shot across the bow to South Africa, was a shot across the bow to Namibia as well. And so, once again, Professor CBS is right on in her critique and chiding, because when you have attempted redistribution in Zimbabwe, folks denounce it. You don't have it to the degree we want in South Africa, folks denounce it. I mean, this is a very difficult audience to please, clearly enough. Right. But I would also say that other than the international situation, there were some internal issues. I would say that one of the most disastrous personnel changes in the history of Africa, perhaps the history of the world, takes place in Polokwane at a special conference of the African National Congress, the ruling party, when Mandela's successor, Thabo Mbeki, is dislodged and Jacob Zuma is put in his place. Now, I don't want to get into Jacob Zuma's business. We all have problems, as you well know. But if you have 4 wives, that means there are 4 sets of aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews and cousins and grandparents and to satisfy. And so that's a petri dish for corruption. And Jacob Zuma does not disappoint in that regard, because it's estimated that he and his cronies looted about $500 billion from the coffers of South Africa. 500 billion US dollars that could have gone to assuaging land hunger, poverty, education, healthcare, etc.
Hey, they could be on the moon with Bezos right now with 500 billion.
Clearly, and actually don't rule it out, because I'm afraid to say what's happening in South Africa as we speak, in my estimation, is sort of a slow motion version of January 6th. That is to say, not only January 6th was just a mass insurrection at one site, even though there are people all over the United States involved, including, and I could talk about this at length, most of them being from Texas. What happened in South Africa, July 2021, was a spreading insurrection, first in Durban, then in Johannesburg, the commercial capital, and it's not over yet. There's a real, because the ANC is basically split. I think the comrades in the first instance should recognize the blunder they made in putting Jacob Zuma in power. Now, I understand why they did it. Number one, there were justifiable complaints about Mbeki, not least with regard to his HIV/AIDS policy. And then there was a need to assuage the Zulus, because there's this idea in South Africa that the ANC is sort of Cosa Nostra. That is to say, the disproportionate percentage of the leadership is XHOSA, OSAS. Zosa Nostra, get it? Like Cosa Nostra? And the Zulus were a major fighting force on the Indian Ocean coast for the most part, had been excluded. That was the idea. And so Jacob Zuma is the leading Zulu politician. the head of intelligence with regard to the African National Congress during the liberation struggle days. And so that was an impetus to boost him into power. But the problem was that coming along with him was this kind of ethnocentrism out of Zululand. Keep in mind that the so-called Inkatha Freedom Party, which during the liberation struggle days was collaborating with the apartheid forces, recall that Gacha Buthelezi, the leader of that faction, was always in Washington meeting with Reagan. And so that opened the door for a certain kind of opportunism to creep into the ANC. I mean, I can't tell you about the factional fighting that's led to deaths, not only in Zululand, but actually spreading out of Zululand in recent years. So it's a very complicated political situation, and I'm afraid to say it's not over yet. Now, I remember with regard to Eswatini, Swaziland, the Black Scholar, you can look it up. They had a special issue on Zimbabwe. And of course, if you go back and look at it, you'll see express what I was just critiquing. All these Negroes complaining about Zimbabwe and basically echoing US imperialism's policy. So I started off my article saying, this small Southern African nation is a human rights disaster. Replete with political prisoners. Of course, Zimbabwe has opposition press, opposition political parties. Of course, I was talking about Swaziland, a last absolute monarchy. In the last few weeks, it's been erupting in protests. The army has been killing people willy-nilly. And I remember it's not only Swaziland that we could have been talking about. I remember I do a lot of work on the Pacifica station in Los Angeles. So I recall about a decade ago, a Pacifica host was asking me to come on and comment about Zimbabwe in a negative fashion. So I said, why don't we talk about Equatorial Guinea? It has millions, if not billions of dollars in US investment in oil. The son of the dictator is a major landowner in Malibu, the playground for the rich and the famous and the rich and the notorious in Southern California. He owns the largest collection of Michael Jackson memorabilia on planet Earth at the time when most of the people were starving, hungry, illiterate, etc. So why don't we talk about Equatorial Guinea? So the host says, well, we'll get to that. 10 years later, I'm still waiting. Because what you realize is that the corporate media sets the agenda, even for the left. And so the people in the left media, they have an hour program. They feel that, it's too much to explain all the backstory about Equatorial Guinea or Swaziland, Eswatini. Zimbabwe's in the news. Robert Mugabe is portrayed as a devil on Saturday Night Live. So there's already a fund of what some might call knowledge, I would call misinformation, with regard to Zimbabwe, so it's easier to talk about. One more point before I turn back the mic to you. I recall the last time I was in Zimbabwe, which was during the height of hysteria about land reform, and I wanted to give a talk at the University of Zimbabwe, where I used to teach. I think the title was The US and Zimbabwe, From the Slave Trade to Bush, something like that. It's not that provocative in terms of the title. Of course, there were objections. And so I had to move it off campus. And I used to, at that time, always walk around listening to the radio. And so I remember walking the streets of Harare, listening to BBC. And on the air, as I was being barred from the university, was this leading so-called Black intellectual in the United States on BBC, denouncing everything that was going on in Zimbabwe while I'm being barred from speaking at the University of Zimbabwe. I rest my case.
All right. Well, I get it together. We at the Remix and on Black Power Media are going to be compiling lists of readings and new suggestions. You've dropped a few gems today, and we want to thank you so much for coming. I am sure we will have you back. And I just want to say to the audience, thanks again for tuning in to the Talk Black. Catch us next week, same black time, same black place.
Peace. Thanks, Dr. Horne.
Thank you.